Hello, Jody. Do you hear us?
Yes, I hear you well. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you for this film. If I counted right, there were at the end 42 sources listed from the archives. How did you find them, and what were you looking for? What was the perspective to search for them? Or can you tell us something about that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to let me do this in English. Um, the archive I worked with was the I in Amsterdam, and the work stems from actually thinking about how are women represented in the archive and why there's an absence of certain kind of catalogings or modes of cataloging women's experiences and women's subjectivities, but also the role of women in society in the archive. And so in many ways, going through the material, as you saw, the number of sources reflect actually that women are not so present in kind of documentation of the archive. So it's about going to find women's experiences that often exist on the margin of main narratives or main experiences. So for example, the images of women working in factories have nothing to do with the fact that women are the labor, but the fact that actually these factories are a way of dealing with an employment or labor crisis during the war, and that these factories can continue producing and harnessing production without actually consideration for the labor that is now sort of being substituted by women's work. So going into the archive, one is constantly looking at the way in which women are often elided in the narratives in the archive, and then kind of putting them together in order to recognize women's experiences.
So are there some keywords or searching tools with you can need to you can use to find them, or is it because you said there's a problem in how they are represented in the archives? Can you tell us something about if it's possible to search for them by special nouns, words, or do you have to go for other things and then have a look on the material to see if you can find that what you're looking for?
Yeah, so the metadata is often actually from the point of view of how we think about what cataloging means from 100 years ago all the way to how we think about it now. So very rarely in an archive of, let's say, 70 years ago, you would have, for example, a log that says, okay, there are women in this particular factory or in this region. It would say things like dancing or factory work or skills. So what you're looking for in an archive is actually rethinking the historical cataloging, and cataloging is based on what is important. So there isn't really, I would say, a prescription for how you would engage the search. It's more about actually thinking what would be considered important in the metadata, 50, 70, 100 years ago, and working with the structure of that metadata, and really working again very closely with the archivist in order to understand how that metadata is cataloged.
This process of rethinking is important to you as a filmmaker, because when you have found these old images, archived images, then there's always the question how to show them today, because just showing them again means reproduction, or anyway, using these image means always dealing with what will they reproduce without the intentions you had to do it. So we had this nice sentence from Volker's film, which was the first one in our program, where somebody is saying the images speak for themselves, which they obviously don't, but or they talk a language maybe we don't want to hear anymore. So can you tell us something about how do you work with these images you found then? So what are your strategies to reuse them, to appropriate them, to decontext, to put them in a new context?
I think you've said something important about, you sort of avoided the word decontextualization, but I think the recontextualization and decontextualization are actually three important moves in rethinking the archive. So the first part is the contextualization, which is the provenance of the archive. Where does it come from? Who created it? And what was its purpose? Then there's the decontextualization, which is actually acts of appropriating it, so that one understands that the way in which it's contextualized is central to the political and economic and cultural framework in which it's produced. And that decontextualization is to say, for example, as a woman, as a person of color, as somebody who's maybe thinking about different kinds of political registers, I need to decontextualize it from the original source material. And then there's the recontextualizing, which is I'm doing the work of a filmmaker in order to make the images do the work that they need for me. I also just want to say I feel like it's a privilege to actually be the last speaker in the last film, because I now have the opportunity to say something about the work that I've seen in the context of the three programs put together. And it seems to me that one of the things that's really important in talking about film or images as evidence is to think about, one, the position of the camera, the point of view, and the idea of perspective. And these three things have absolutely radically shifted and changed over time. From the point of view and the position that actually the ubiquity of the camera, the fact that we have it on our phones, the fact that civilians are actually making images and posting it, has totally changed our relationship to the idea of the forensic nature of the image. So previously we might have argued that the image is the evidence itself, and it exists as the undeniable account of a truth. And what we know more and more, and this goes as far back as kind of cinema's relationship to Antonioni's blow up, or the idea that in the evolution of how we think about the image as a forensic evidence is also from the Rodney King tapes, all the way to the way we think about social justice and the way in which civilian footage now, and the fact that there's surveillance cameras all over at corner streets, becomes a way in which, from the perspective and point of view and the position in which the camera is placed, that nature of evidence making has totally shifted. And I think that's what makes this conversation really, really interesting and highly important and very charged, because that perspective and the idea of the image is the evidence is something that has totally become very challenged in how we think about the forensic nature of the image.
For your work on having already archived images there means the position of the camera to intervene in these images with techniques like zooming or repetition, or even what you are doing, writing something on the image or put some image on it. Can you tell us a bit about how does this work was done? Did you first made a pure way of the old archive and then intervene there, or what you started you by doing the montage and cutting all these things together already with these interventions you used to make this material seen in a new context?
Yeah, I think it's a twofold approach. There isn't a, I mean, the one of the things I want to disclose is that the zooming in, the focusing, is all about kind of a practice of an ethics, right? So in other words, by certain kinds of gestures of repetition, certain zooming in and then re-showing you the image in different ways, is actually also disclosure to an audience that I'm in conversation with you in disclosing how I'm negotiating and renegotiating the image based on the value that I want to give it. Because in some ways, it's about thinking with an audience, that I'm not affording a singular value to the image, but I'm negotiating the meaning and the value of the image through repetition, through zooming in, through slowing it down. And slowing it down, zooming in, affords a different value to the image. And I mean, I love the way in which, we all, the three films work in relation to each other, because in some ways all the films are kind of strategically doing that. They're zooming in, they kind of creating focuses or foci in different ways, either from from a position of perspective, point of view, or positionality, in order to make an argument for the image. And I think that's pretty much what I'm doing in Cause of Death. I mean, there's no way to say I made the edit and then I zoomed in. It's like saying, do I change a word as you're writing? Do I change the word at the end of a paragraph, or do I change it as I'm writing? And I think it's the same kind of thinking. If you think about the grammar of cinema and the grammar really of images, the close-up, the grammar of the close-up has a different meaning from the wide. So you kind of working with changing the grammar and changing the what I would call the word choice as you building a paragraph or a sequence or a set of ideas, because you're thinking, how am I negotiating the meaning of these sequences or the image with an audience?
And because we have seen this movie sensitive content before, was in your research, was there some content which was so sensitive that you thought you couldn't reframe it, recontextualize it, reuse it, because the obvious or the old sense of this image or this scene is so powerful that you can't really doing the work of recontextualization with this special image or sequence?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question about actually representability and violence. I think there's a way in which the contemporary discourse is about sort of warnings and sensitivities around violence and how much can be shown and how much can't be shown. And I guess for every filmmaker, the aesthetic and ethical registers are different for all of us. So I can only speak for myself as kind of a person who comes from the Southern Hemisphere, where the colonial and apartheid history has been so powerfully connected with ideas of violence, and not just ideas of violence, but the experiences of violence, that what I argue has no kind of, it has never had any barriers or warnings. So in some ways, when I was making Cause of Death, because it's such a history of violence directed towards women's bodies, I felt that it was important that that violence be absolutely uncompromised. So the visceral experience of the film is very important for me.
I will just take a look if somebody from the audience, there is one question, so we will wait for a microphone and address it to you.
Thank you for coming forward.
Hi. Yeah, I was sitting in the second row, so it wasn't a big deal. I was just wondering if it maybe, did it change the way the archives work, your work? Because I was wondering if you were always changing for women, maybe they kind of like added a keyword that is woman, like something in the direction, if you made a change there, created a dialogue in a way.
Can you just say it a little slowly, because there's a lot of static on your end. So your question is, did I change? Can you just do that again?
Kind of like the way, because you were searching through the archives for those images, and you couldn't directly search for the word woman, for example, if I got that right. So maybe so you were looking for it, and maybe they saw, oh, there is a need for that keyword, like maybe we should change the way we catalog our images so it's easier for other people to interact with them. Maybe it changed something there. I was wondering if that maybe happened.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I'll tell you why it's a wonderful question, because it's been something that archivists are talking about a lot. And it speaks to a very complex political moment that we're in right now, which is, do you start renaming things and go back historically and rename everything. And something will be very interesting in the erasure, in the historical erasure that will happen. So for example, this work exists as part of a trilogy of an archive. So the first part of the work, called When I Grow Up I Want to Be a Black Man, is about race. The second part, which you've watched this afternoon, which is around gender, called Cause of Death. And the third one, which is called Loving in Between, which deals with sexuality and particularly LGBTQ, right, identity. And of course, you can't go into a search engine and look for the word queer. It's not going to arrive. So you could do one of two things. So for example, the archivists will say, okay, Jyoti's found these things and we'll put the tag woman now because the material reveals that there's women in the factory. But something interesting will happen, which is it starts coding the archive in a totally different way, because it's now dealing with an erasure that historically wasn't there. So for example, if you start correcting, quote unquote, correcting the archive, as I would call it, and stop allowing the historical, that's what I would call the historical prejudices to be there, it starts, quote unquote, correcting the archive to a contemporary political climate. And it hides the historical biases that the archive has. So on the one hand, it's important that we do that. On the other hand, I think it's also important that we don't hide the fact that those racial, gender, sexual prejudices did exist in history. Because it's doing a different kind of work. Yeah, it's a wonderfully complex question. Thank you for that.
Maybe, yeah, thank you. Maybe to ask, your work on these archive films will be attached to the archive, so that people who come to the archive at least did know or can know that you did this work. I mean, are these films seen there or attached in any way, so that the work you've done with the archive material leaves traces in the archive itself?
That's the work that the archivists do. So they definitely, my contractual obligation with the Eye is that I will give back the films that I've made with their material. And so they also tag that, you know, I've used this film in my work, so that if you went to the archive now and found the source material, it would lead you to my film as a way to say, this is the way in which it's been appropriated now, that's my word, or recontextualized in the context of this film. So in some ways what you're doing is a tracking or a mapping of the different iterations in which a film's been used. And this is not just only with my work. There's a way in which, for example, the archive does track, for example, a film. There's a very famous Dutch cheese ad that used a whole lot of archival material to build a 1980s piece of cheese advertising. And you can see with that ad all the different, you know, source materials that they've been used. So I think that's important work that the archive does, because the radical recontextualization also means that maybe 100 years from now, somebody is going to look at my film and go, oh, look, she's appropriated in this way, and our politics have shifted so much that there might be a radical questioning of the way in which, for example, I might have interpreted that material. So with our political framework, the way we understand social justice, the way we understand representational politics is evolving in quite radical ways because of the ubiquity of the camera. That I'm not saying that, I mean, this is my reading of this material at this particular historical moment. And maybe even 10 years from now, I might rethink my own political position on how I've used this material.
Thank you very much. Maybe because we have to go on in the program, but a very last short question, or because we talked so much about images, but there is some text in your movie. Can you tell us about why in that way? How did you invented it, or how did you realize that there is a need for text, and in the way the text is there performed by spoken word? Yeah. What about the text? Why this audio?
Yeah, so this particular text I did in collaboration with a spoken word artist from South Africa. Her name is Napo Mashiane. And it was a way of actually writing back an African experience into very much kind of a European archive. But I mean, you can see there's a lot of ethnographic material. And when I use the word ethnographic, I don't mean simply ethnography that takes place sort of from a European perspective to an African perspective, but the ethnography in a sense that, you know, these camera people went, you know, to rural parts of the Netherlands, to Romania, to even parts of Germany, as you've probably recognized some of the images. And so this kind of documenting, I needed to figure out how to make the woman's experience visible. And it goes back to earlier conversation you were having around the way in which the image requires textual contextualization. So without the text, you can read an image, but you are arriving at a surface reading of the image. The context, which is often a text, destabilizes and restabilizes the meaning of the image.
Thank you very much, Jyoti, for these explanations and this talk and your film.
Thank you so much for having me, and I wish you a good afternoon.